The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Tucson post office, and Violet Harper pressed her hand against the wooden seat to steady herself as dust billowed through the open window, coating her dark traveling dress in a fine layer of Arizona grit. She could not hear the driver shouting or the horses snorting with exhaustion after their long journey, but she felt the vibrations through the floorboards and knew they had finally arrived at her destination on this scorching afternoon in July of 1882. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed down her skirts and checked that the small carpet bag at her feet was secure, the one containing all her worldly possessions and the carefully folded letters from Ethan Irving, the rancher who had agreed to marry her sight unseen. The door swung open, and a weathered hand reached in to help her down. Violet accepted it gratefully, stepping into the bright sunlight that made her squint. The man who had helped her was already turning away, his lips moving as he spoke to someone else. She had learned long ago to read the subtle signs of conversation, the way people's shoulders shifted when they addressed each other, how their eyes focused on whoever was speaking. 3 men stood near the hitching post, their attention on her for only a moment before returning to their own business. Violet scanned the street, searching for the man she had traveled over 1,000 miles to meet. Ethan had written that he would be waiting at the post office, that he was tall with dark hair and would wear a black hat with a silver band. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked from face to face, but none of them seemed to be looking for anyone in particular. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel sweat beginning to dampen the back of her neck beneath her pinned-up auburn hair. A tall figure emerged from the post office, and Violet's breath caught. He was exactly as Ethan had described himself, standing well over 6 feet with broad shoulders that filled out his dusty work shirt. His black hat sat low on his head, and yes, there was the silver band catching the light. He held a piece of paper in his hands, studying it with a frown that creased his tanned forehead. When he looked up, his eyes were the color of honey in sunlight, and they swept across the street before landing on her. Violet tried to smile, but her lips felt stiff with nervousness. She had written to Ethan about her deafness in her second letter, explaining carefully that she had lost her hearing to scarlet fever when she was 6 years old. She had learned to read lips reasonably well, though it was not always perfect, and she could speak, though her own voice sounded strange to her now after so many years of not hearing it. She had been terrified that he would change his mind, that he would write back saying he needed a wife who could hear the baby crying in the night or listen for danger approaching. Instead, his next letter had been kind, saying that what mattered was finding a good woman to share his life with, and if she was willing to come all this way, he was willing to make things work. Ethan walked toward her, his gait steady and purposeful. When he stopped in front of her, he removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that was slightly too long and curled at his collar. His lips moved and Violet focused intently on them. "Miss Harper," she read from the shape of his mouth. She nodded and forced herself to speak. "Yes." "You are Ethan Irving," he nodded, and something like relief crossed his features. He gestured to her bag, and she understood he was offering to carry it. She handed it to him, noticing the calluses on his palms and the strength in his fingers as he took it. They stood awkwardly for a moment, and Violet could see him searching for words. His mouth opened and closed, and she caught fragments. Journey and tired and something else she could not make out. "I am sorry," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could. "I must see your face clearly to understand. The sun is in my eyes." Ethan's expression shifted to understanding, and he moved slightly so that his face was no longer backlit by the harsh afternoon glare. He spoke again, slower this time, and she read, "Was your journey difficult?" "Long," Violet replied, but I am glad to finally be here." He nodded again, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. He was nervous too, she realized, and the thought gave her courage. They were both taking an enormous chance. Two strangers bound by nothing more than hopeful letters and mutual need. Ethan gestured down the street, and Violet understood they were going to his wagon. She walked beside him, acutely aware of the people watching them. Tucson was not a large town, and the arrival of a mail-order bride was likely significant gossip. She kept her chin up and her eyes forward, refusing to let shame or self-consciousness make her cower. The wagon was simple but well-maintained, and Ethan's horse was a sturdy bay mare with kind eyes. He placed Violet's bag in the back and then turned to help her up onto the seat. His hands at her waist were gentle but firm, and she felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest as he lifted her easily. She settled onto the wooden bench, arranging her skirts, and Ethan climbed up beside her. As they began to move through town, Violet took in her surroundings. Tucson was dusty and brown, with low adobe buildings and wooden structures that looked like they had been baked by the sun. Mountains rose in the distance, purple and hazy in the heat. It was so different from Philadelphia, where she had grown up in a cramped boarding house run by her aunt after her parents died. The city had been crowded and noisy, though of course Violet had experienced the noise only as vibrations and the visual chaos of constant movement. Ethan's ranch was several miles outside of town, and the ride gave Violet time to study him from the corner of her eye. His profile was strong, with a straight nose and a firm jaw shadowed by stubble. His hands on the reins were steady, and she noticed a scar across his left knuckles. He glanced at her occasionally, and each time their eyes met, he offered a small, hesitant smile. The ranch, when it came into view, was more substantial than Violet had expected. The house was adobe with a wooden porch, single-story but sprawling, with several outbuildings nearby. A corral held half a dozen horses, and she could see cattle in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. Chickens pecked in a yard near what looked like a small barn, and a windmill turned slowly, pumping water into a trough. Ethan brought the wagon to a stop near the house and jumped down, coming around to help Violet descend. This time she was ready for the feel of his hands at her waist, but it still sent that strange flutter through her. When her feet touched the ground, she looked up at him, and for a moment they simply stood there, strangers on the brink of becoming something more. He released her and stepped back, then gestured to the house. His lips formed words, "Let me show you." Inside, the house was dim and cool after the blazing heat outside. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 6 chairs, and a cooking stove that looked relatively new. Doorways led to what Violet assumed were bedrooms. Everything was clean but spare, the home of a man who lived alone and saw no need for decoration. Ethan set her bag down and turned to face her. He spoke, and she read his lips carefully. "You will have the bedroom on the left. I will sleep in the other. We can wait to marry properly when you are ready." Violet felt a rush of gratitude for his consideration. She had been dreading this moment, uncertain of what would be expected of her immediately. "Thank you," she said. "That is very kind." He ducked his head, looking almost embarrassed, and she realized he might be just as uncertain about all of this as she was. They were both taking a leap of faith. Over the next few days, Violet learned the rhythms of the ranch. She woke before dawn when the light began to filter through her bedroom window, dressed quickly, and started breakfast. Ethan would come in from the barn, smelling of hay and horses, and they would eat together in silence. At first, the silence was awkward, but gradually it became comfortable. Ethan would watch her face when he spoke. making sure she could see his lips, and he learned to speak more slowly and clearly without her having to ask. Violet threw herself into making the house a home. She swept and scrubbed, washed curtains that had gone gray with dust, and used some of the household money Ethan gave her to buy fabric in town for new ones. She planted herbs near the kitchen door and spent hours in the chicken coop, collecting eggs and talking to the hens even though she could not hear their clucking responses. The physical work was exhausting but satisfying. In the evenings, after supper, Ethan would sit at the table and work on the ranch accounts or mend tack, and Violet would sew or read. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her, and when their eyes met, he would offer that same small smile. She found herself watching him too, noticing the way he moved with economical grace, how he was gentle with the animals, and how he never showed impatience when she misunderstood something he said. 2 weeks after her arrival, Ethan came in from town with a book tucked under his arm. He set it on the table in front of Violet with a look of cautious hope on his face. She picked it up, and her heart skipped when she read the title, A Manual of Sign Language. She looked up at him, and he spoke slowly. "I thought we could learn together. It might be easier than always watching lips." Tears pricked at Violet's eyes. In Philadelphia, no one had ever bothered to learn how to communicate with her beyond the basics. Her aunt had considered her deafness an inconvenience, and the other boarders had mostly ignored her. The fact that Ethan had sought this out, had spent his own money on it, touched something deep inside her. "Yes," she said, her voice catching. "I would like that very much." That night, they sat together at the table with the lamp burning between them, poring over the book. The manual showed drawings of hand positions and explained the meanings. Ethan's large, calloused hands looked almost comical as he tried to form the letters of the alphabet, but he was patient with himself, practicing each one until he got it right. Violet helped him, gently adjusting his fingers when needed and feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. They started with simple words. "Hello," "Thank you," "Please." Ethan's brow furrowed with concentration as he worked through each sign, and Violet found herself enchanted by his dedication. When he successfully signed "good night" to her before heading to his bedroom, she felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. As the weeks passed, their signing improved. They began to have actual conversations, halting at first but gradually becoming more fluid. Ethan told her about the ranch, how he had built it up from almost nothing over the past 8 years. He spoke of his parents, who had died when he was 20, leaving him with a small inheritance that he had used to buy this land. He admitted that he had been lonely, that the isolation of ranch life had worn on him, and that he had decided to seek a wife because he wanted to share his life with someone. Violet told him about her own past, about losing her hearing and then her parents, about the cold years in her aunt's boarding house, where she had been more servant than family. She explained that when her aunt died last year, there had been no money left, and she had been faced with the prospect of finding work in a factory or taking her chances as a mail-order bride. She had chosen the latter because at least it offered hope. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Ethan turned to her and signed, "Are you happy here?" Violet considered the question. She was happier than she had been in years, but she was also aware of the strangeness of her situation. They lived as companions, not as husband and wife, and she still did not know what Ethan truly thought of her. "Yes," she signed back. "Are you happy that I came?" He nodded, and then his hands moved again. "I think we should marry soon if you want to." Violet's heart began to race. "Do you want to marry me?" Ethan's eyes held hers, and he signed slowly. "Yes, I know this was all done through letters, but I like who you are. You work hard, You are kind. You are strong. I would be proud to call you my wife." It was not a declaration of love, but it was honest and real. Violet signed back, "I would like to be your wife." They were married the following Saturday at the small church in Tucson. The minister was an elderly man who seemed surprised by their ability to communicate through signs, but was kind enough. Only a handful of people attended, mostly neighboring ranchers whom Ethan knew. Violet wore a simple cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, and Ethan wore his best shirt and a string tie. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan lifted her hand and kissed it gently, and Violet felt tears slip down her cheeks. The wedding night was awkward and tender. Ethan was patient, moving slowly, always watching her face to make sure she was all right. Violet had been nervous, but his gentleness eased her fears. Afterward, as they lay in the darkness of his bedroom, which was now theirs, Ethan pulled her close and signed against her palm. "Thank you," she signed back. "For what?" "For taking a chance on me." Violet nestled against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her cheek. She had taken a chance, and so far, it seemed to be paying off. As autumn arrived and the brutal heat of summer began to ease, Violet and Ethan settled into married life. They worked side by side, Ethan teaching her how to help with the horses and cattle, and Violet showing him how to improve the garden and preserve food for winter. Their signing became more sophisticated, and they developed their own shorthand for common phrases and inside jokes. One October morning, Violet was feeding the chickens when she felt the vibrations of hoofbeats approaching fast. She turned to see a rider coming hard toward the ranch, and her stomach clenched with sudden worry. She ran toward the corral where Ethan was working with a young colt. When he saw her face, he immediately vaulted over the fence. She pointed toward the approaching rider, and Ethan's expression grew serious. They waited together as the man pulled his horse to a stop. Violet recognized him as Tom Carson, whose ranch was about 10 miles to the north. Tom was speaking rapidly, his face flushed and his gestures wild. Ethan's expression grew darker as he listened, and Violet felt frustration rise in her that she could not follow what was being said. Finally, Ethan turned to her and signed, "Cattle thieves. They hit Tom's place last night." "Took nearly 50 head. Violet's eyes widened. "That was a devastating loss," she signed. "What will you do?" "Go with the other men to track them. Tom says they are gathering at the Miller Ranch." Fear gripped Violet. She had heard about the violence that could erupt in these situations, and the thought of Ethan riding into danger made her chest tight. She grabbed his arm and he looked down at her. "Be careful," she signed. He covered her hand with his and signed with the other. "I will come back to you." "I promise." Ethan went inside to get his rifle, and Violet felt helpless as she watched him saddle his best horse. Tom waited impatiently, his horse dancing in place. When Ethan was ready, he came to Violet and kissed her forehead, then her lips, a brief but fierce kiss that tasted of promise. Then he was riding away, and Violet stood in the yard watching until he disappeared from view. She wrapped her arms around herself, despite the warmth of the day, and prayed to a God she was not sure listened to a plea she could not voice aloud. The rest of that day crawled by. Violet tried to keep busy, but every task felt meaningless. She kept looking toward the horizon, hoping to see Ethan returning. When darkness fell, she lit the lamps and sat at the table, her hands busy with mending she did not really see. She must have dozed off because she woke with a start to see lamplight flickering. The room was still dark outside the windows, which meant it was the middle of the night. She looked around, disoriented, and then saw the door opening. Ethan stepped inside, and relief flooded through Violet so powerfully that her knees went weak. She jumped up and ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. He held her tightly, and she could feel the tension in his body, the exhaustion in the way he leaned into her. When she pulled back, she saw that he was dirty and there was a cut on his cheek, but he seemed otherwise unhurt. She touched the wound gently and he caught her hand, kissing her fingers. "What happened?" she signed when he released her. Ethan sank into a chair, and Violet pumped water for him to drink and wet a cloth to clean his face. As she tended to him, he signed the story. They had tracked the thieves south toward the border. There had been a confrontation, shots fired, but the thieves had scattered, leaving most of the cattle behind. 2 of the thieves had been captured, and the rest had fled into Mexico. No one from their group had been seriously hurt, though one man had taken a bullet through his hat. "I am glad you are home," Violet signed. "I kept thinking of you here alone," Ethan signed back. "It made me careful." They went to bed, and Ethan fell asleep almost immediately, his arm heavy across Violet's waist. She lay awake for a long time, listening with her body to the sound of his breathing, feeling grateful that he had kept his promise to come back. As winter approached, Violet realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week to be sure, and then another, before she allowed herself to believe it. She was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. She had always wanted children, but the thought of being responsible for a tiny life was overwhelming. She waited until evening to tell Ethan. They had finished supper and were sitting together on the sofa he had recently purchased in town, a surprising addition to the sparse house. Violet took his hand and placed it on her stomach, then signed, "I think there is going to be a baby." Ethan's eyes widened and his mouth opened in surprise. "You are sure?" "Fairly sure. My courses have not come for 2 months." A grin spread across Ethan's face, wider than any expression Violet had seen from him before. He signed, "This is wonderful news." Then he did something that surprised her. He slid off the sofa and knelt in front of her, placing both his hands on her still flat stomach. He looked up at her, and his lips moved in words she could read. "Thank you." Violet ran her fingers through his hair, her heart so full it ached. This quiet, steady man had given her a home, a purpose, and now they were creating a family together. It felt like a miracle. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Ethan became almost comically protective, insisting that Violet rest more and not lift anything heavy. She humored him because she could see the love behind his fussing. Her belly grew, and she felt the baby moving inside her, strange flutters that gradually became stronger kicks. In February, Ethan came home from town with another surprise. He had been to see a teacher who had passed through Tucson, someone who knew more sign language than what their book contained. He had spent hours with this teacher, learning more complex signs and phrases. That evening, he sat Violet down and practiced with her, showing her what he had learned. They were sitting close together, their hands moving between them when Ethan suddenly stopped. He looked nervous, his jaw tense. Violet tilted her head, questioning. Slowly, carefully, Ethan's hands moved through a series of signs she did not recognize. She watched, trying to puzzle out the meaning, but she could not figure it out. She shook her head and Ethan's face fell slightly. He tried again, slower this time, and Violet focused intently. The 3 signs were deliberate and specific. Her breath caught as understanding dawned. He had signed, "I love you." Tears sprang to Violet's eyes immediately. She had known Ethan cared for her, had seen it in his actions and the gentle way he treated her, but he had never said those words. To learn these signs specifically, to seek out a teacher so he could tell her in a language that was becoming truly theirs, meant everything. Her hands trembled as she signed back, "I love you too." Ethan pulled her into his arms, careful of her rounded stomach, and held her as she cried. When she finally pulled back and wiped her eyes, she saw that his own eyes were damp. She cupped his face in her hands and kissed him, pouring all her feelings into it. That night, as they lay in bed with Ethan's hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby kick, Violet felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. She had come to Arizona expecting at best a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement. Instead, she had found love. Spring arrived with wildflowers blooming across the desert and new calves wobbling after their mothers in the pasture. Violet's belly had grown large, and she moved more slowly now, but she was still determined to do her share of work. Ethan had hired a young man named Billy to help with the heavier ranch work, which eased both of their minds. In April, Violet's pains began in the middle of the night. She shook Ethan awake, and he shot up in bed, instantly alert. "Is it time?" he signed. She nodded, breathing through a contraction. Ethan dressed quickly and ran out to saddle a horse. He had arranged weeks ago for the doctor in town to come when the baby was ready, and also for Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had experience with birthing, to attend. Ethan rode hard for town while Violet tried to stay calm. She had helped her aunt deliver a baby once, years ago, so she had some idea of what to expect, but experiencing it herself was entirely different. The pains came in waves, growing stronger and closer together. Mrs. Chen arrived first, her basket of supplies in hand and her weathered face calm and reassuring. She could not sign, but she had a gentle way about her that needed no words. She examined Violet and nodded approvingly, then made her comfortable and prepared the room. The doctor came about an hour later, a gruff man named Dr. Patterson who had been practicing in Tucson for 20 years. Ethan returned with him, his face pale with worry. He came to Violet's side and took her hand, and she gripped it hard as another contraction seized her. The labor lasted through the morning and into the afternoon. It was harder than Violet had imagined, waves of pain that seemed unending. But Ethan never left her side. He held her hand, wiped her face with a cool cloth, and signed encouragement whenever she could focus enough to see his hands. "You are strong," he told her. "You can do this. I am here." Finally, as the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, the baby came. Violet felt a rush of relief as the pain suddenly eased, and then she heard nothing but saw the sudden activity as Dr. Patterson and Mrs. Chen worked quickly. She craned her neck, desperate to see, and then Mrs. Chen was turning with a small, squirming bundle wrapped in a blanket. "A boy," Dr. Patterson said, and Violet read his lips. "A healthy boy, Mrs." Chen placed the baby in Violet's arms, and she looked down at the tiny red face, the little fists waving, the mouth opening and closing. Her son. Their son. Tears streamed down her face as she examined every perfect finger and toe. Ethan leaned over them both, his own face wet with tears. He touched the baby's head gently, reverently, and then signed to Violet. "He is beautiful. You are amazing." They named him Samuel Irving after Ethan's father. Sam, as they called him, was a good baby, easy-going and content. Violet learned to watch for his cries by the way his face screwed up and turned red, and she became attuned to his needs. Ethan was a devoted father, coming in from work throughout the day to check on them both, holding Sam with a tenderness that made Violet fall even more in love with him. The months after Sam's birth were a blur of exhaustion and joy. Violet and Ethan worked out systems for nighttime feedings, Ethan waking her when the baby cried since she could not hear it. They took turns walking the floor with Sam when he was fussy, and they marveled together over every small milestone, the first smile, the first time he rolled over, the way his eyes tracked their movements. As Sam grew, Violet noticed that he responded to sound. He would turn his head when Ethan spoke, and loud noises would startle him. She had wondered during her pregnancy whether the baby might be deaf like her, and while part of her would have been fine with that, she was glad he could hear. It would make his life easier. But she was determined that Sam would grow up knowing sign language as well as spoken words. From the beginning, she and Ethan signed to him constantly, narrating their actions and their love. "Mama loves you," she would sign as she fed him. "Papa is here," Ethan would sign when he picked him up. By the time Sam was a year old, he was trying to sign back. His chubby hands could not quite form the shapes correctly, but they could see him trying. The first sign he mastered was "more," which he used enthusiastically at mealtimes. The second was "Papa," and the third was "Mama." And both Violet and Ethan cried the first time he used them properly. Life on the ranch found its rhythm. The cattle business was good, and Ethan was able to hire another hand, which gave him more time with his family. They went to town every few weeks for supplies, and Violet became friendly with some of the other women, especially Sarah Miller, whose husband owned the ranch where the men had gathered during the cattle rustling incident. Sarah was a practical woman with 4 children of her own, and she took Violet under her wing, teaching her techniques for dealing with the Arizona heat and the challenges of frontier life. Sarah learned some basic signs so she could communicate directly with Violet, which touched Violet deeply. Through Sarah, Violet began to feel like she was part of a community rather than an outsider. When Sam was 2, Violet discovered she was pregnant again. She told Ethan while they were working together in the garden, Sam playing nearby in the dirt. Ethan's face lit up with joy, and he immediately signed, "I love you," followed by "Our family grows." This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Violet knew what to expect. She was also chasing after an active toddler, which left less time to worry about aches and pains. Sam seemed to sense something was different and became more cuddly, often resting his head on Violet's growing belly. In the spring of 1885, Violet gave birth to another boy, this time with much less drama. The labor was shorter, and Jacob Irving entered the world with a lusty cry that Violet could not hear but could see in the way his whole body shook with the effort. Ethan signed to her, "He has strong lungs." With 2 young children, the house was always busy. Sam was a devoted big brother, wanting to help with everything, though his help was often more hindrance. Jacob was a more demanding baby than Sam had been, but he was also quick to smile, and his laughter, which Violet felt rather than heard, could light up a room. Ethan expanded the house that summer, adding 2 bedrooms so the boys would have their own spaces as they grew. He worked on it in the evenings and on Sundays, and Violet would bring him water and food, Sam and baby Jacob in tow. It was hard work, but satisfying, building something permanent and solid. One evening in late summer, after the boys were asleep, Violet and Ethan sat on the porch as they often did. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the air was finally cooling after another blazing day. Ethan took Violet's hand and signed, "Do you remember when you first arrived?" "How could I forget? I was terrified." "So was I," Ethan signed. "I thought I had made a terrible mistake. What if we could not understand each other? What if you hated it here? And now?" Ethan's hands moved slowly, deliberately. "Now I cannot imagine my life without you. You made this house a home. You gave me sons. You taught me to communicate in ways I never knew existed. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Violet's throat tightened with emotion. She signed back, "You saved me. I was so alone before. You gave me a family, a purpose, a place to belong. You learned my language. You made me feel seen." "I love you," Ethan signed. "I love you too," Violet signed back. They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the stars wheel overhead. In the house behind them, their children slept peacefully. Around them, the ranch they had built together stretched out in the darkness. It was a good life, hard-earned and deeply cherished. As the years passed, the Irving family continued to grow and thrive. Sam started helping with ranch chores as soon as he was old enough, shadowing his father and learning everything Ethan could teach him. Jacob was more interested in books and would sit for hours looking at the pictures in the few volumes they owned. Both boys were fluent in sign language, switching effortlessly between signing and speaking. Violet had worried that the boys might see signing as something unusual or lesser, but Ethan had made sure from the beginning that they understood it was simply another way of communicating, as valid as spoken words. He told them stories of their mother's bravery in coming all the way from Philadelphia to marry a stranger, of how she had made the ranch a better place. He made sure they understood that being deaf was just one aspect of who Violet was, not a limitation or a tragedy. When Sam was 8 and Jacob was 6, Violet gave birth to their first daughter. They named her Rose, and she was the image of Violet with auburn hair and green eyes. Rose was a bright, curious child who seemed to understand sign language almost instinctively. By the time she was 3, she was interpreting for her mother when they went to town. A tiny but fierce advocate, the ranch prospered. Ethan had a good eye for cattle and horses, and his reputation for honest dealing spread. They were able to save money, to improve the house further, to buy better equipment. But more than the material success, what mattered to both Violet and Ethan was the family they had built. One spring evening when Rose was 5, making her 10 years after Violet's arrival in Tucson, the whole family gathered on the porch after supper. It had become a tradition, this evening time together. Sam was 13 now, gangly and growing fast with his father's honey-colored eyes. Jacob was 11, quieter than his brother but with a sharp mind. Rose sat in Violet's lap, playing with her mother's fingers. Ethan was telling a story, his hands moving in sign while his voice spoke the words aloud so all the children could follow in their preferred way. It was a story about a cowboy and his horse, one of the children's favorites. Violet watched her family, her heart full to bursting. Sam's hands were moving too, adding details to his father's story, and Jacob was watching intently, his expression serious. Rose giggled, the vibration of it carrying through her small body into Violet's arms. Ethan's eyes met Violet's across the porch, and he signed with one hand, not interrupting his story. "Happy," she signed back. "Yes, very happy." Later, after the children were in bed, Violet and Ethan lay together in the darkness of their room. Ethan's arm was around her, and she rested her head on his chest. His hand moved to where she could see it in the faint moonlight coming through the window. "You ever regret it?" he signed. "Coming here, marrying me." Violet propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Never," she signed emphatically. "This is the life I dreamed of but never thought I would have. Do you regret sending for me?" "Not for one single day," Ethan signed. "You are my heart." She kissed him then, deep and lingering, and his arms tightened around her. After all these years, the passion between them had not dimmed. If anything, it had grown stronger, built on a foundation of respect, communication, and genuine love. The children grew older, and the ranch continued to thrive. Sam at 16 was already a skilled rancher, and Ethan began to teach him the business side of things, preparing him to one day take over. Jacob discovered a talent for working with horses, able to gentle even the most skittish animals. Rose was everyone's darling, bright and energetic and utterly fearless. In 1892, when Violet was 32 and Ethan was 40, they had their fourth and final child, another boy they named Daniel. By then, Sam was 17 and already courting a girl from town. Jacob was 15 and dreaming of starting his own horse breeding operation. And Rose was 8 and ruling the household with cheerful tyranny. Daniel's arrival was a surprise but a welcome one. The older children doted on him, and Violet found herself savoring these moments with her youngest in a way she had been too tired and overwhelmed to do with the others. Ethan was more relaxed too, a veteran father now, confident in ways he had not been with Sam. One afternoon when Daniel was about 6 months old, Violet was in the kitchen preparing supper while the baby slept in a cradle nearby. Rose was at the table doing her schoolwork, and through the window, Violet could see Ethan and the boys working with the horses. It was an ordinary moment, nothing special, but as Violet looked around at her life, she felt profound gratitude. She thought back to that frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Tucson 10 years earlier, not knowing what the future held. She thought about the letters she had exchanged with Ethan, carefully crafted to present the best version of herself while still being honest about her deafness. She thought about the fear that he would reject her, that she would end up alone in a strange place. Instead, she had found love. Real, deep, abiding love. She had found a man who saw her deafness not as a deficiency but simply as a fact, and who had put in the effort to learn to communicate with her in the ways that worked best. She had built a family, raised children who were kind and capable, and who moved between 2 languages as easily as breathing. Rose looked up from her work and caught her mother's eye. "What are you thinking about, Mama?" she signed. "How lucky I am," Violet signed back. "We are lucky too," Rose signed. "You are the best Mama." Violet smiled and ruffled her daughter's auburn curls. These moments of simple connection, of being understood and loved, were what made life beautiful. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Ethan came to find Violet in the kitchen where she was finishing the last of the dishes. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. He turned her around to face him, his hands still damp from helping with the dishes moving to sign. "You know what day it is," he signed. Violet thought for a moment, then shook her head. 10 years ago today you arrived in Tucson," Ethan signed. 10 years since you stepped off that stagecoach and changed my life." Violet felt tears prick her eyes. She had not remembered the exact date, but Ethan had. "Has it been 10 years?" she signed. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "I want you to know," Ethan signed, his movements slow and deliberate, "that you are loved. Not just by me, though I love you more than I can ever fully express, but by our children, by our friends, by this community. You are respected and valued. You are not just my wife. You are my partner, my best friend, the person I want to share everything with." Tears spilled down Violet's cheeks, and she signed through them. "You gave me a life I never dreamed was possible. You learned to speak my language. You made me feel whole." "You were always whole," Ethan signed. "I just learned to see it." They held each other in the quiet kitchen, the lamp flickering on the table, the night sounds of the ranch surrounding them. Outside, an owl was probably calling, and cattle were settling for the night, and the wind was probably rustling through the cottonwoods by the creek. Violet experienced it all through vibration and sight, through the feel of Ethan's heartbeat against her cheek, and the solid reality of his arms around her. The years continued to unfold. Sam married his sweetheart, Annie, when he was 20, and they built a house on the far side of the ranch property. Within a year, they had made Violet and Ethan grandparents to a baby girl named Emma. Violet was only 35, young to be a grandmother, but she reveled in the role. Jacob, true to his dreams, started a horse breeding program that became quite successful. He had an almost magical touch with horses, and people came from all over southern Arizona to buy his stock. He married at 23, a quiet girl named Beth who worked in the general store in Tucson. Rose grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's determination and her father's practical nature. She was in no hurry to marry, declaring that she wanted to see something of the world first. When she was 18, she went to stay with Violet's cousins in Philadelphia for 6 months, and the letters she sent home were full of wonder and observations. But when she came back, she declared that Arizona was home and she had no desire to live anywhere else. Daniel was the baby of the family, growing up surrounded by older siblings and nieces and nephews. He was a happy, easy-going child who showed signs of inheriting his mother's artistic talents. Violet had taken up painting in her spare time, and Daniel would sit for hours watching her work, eventually trying his own hand at it. As Ethan entered his 50s and Violet her 40s, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch was largely run by Sam now, with Jacob's horse operation as a successful side business. Ethan still worked every day, but the physical labor was shared among the hands they employed. He had more time to spend with Violet, and they took advantage of it. They would take walks in the evening, following the creek that ran through their property, Ethan pointing out plants and animals and Violet identifying them by sight. They would sit together on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, their hands moving in conversation that had become as natural as breathing. They would work side by side in the garden that Violet had expanded over the years, growing vegetables and flowers and herbs. One evening in the late summer of 1897, when they had been married for 15 years, Ethan took Violet's hand and led her away from the house, out to a spot on a small rise where they could see the whole ranch spread out below them. The house, now much expanded from the simple adobe structure Violet had first seen, was lit with warm light. Smoke rose from the chimney. In the various paddocks and pens, animals moved in the dusk. Sam and Annie's house had lights in the windows too, and Jacob and Beth had just broken ground on their own place nearby. "Look at what we built," Ethan sighed. "Not just the buildings and the business, but the family, the life. You and I started with nothing but hope and letters, and look at what we created." Violet surveyed their domain, and she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It had not been easy. There had been hard times, droughts that killed cattle, times when money was tight, illnesses and injuries and the constant challenges of frontier life. But they had faced it all together, and they had built something lasting. "I could not have done any of this without you," Violet sighed. "You made me brave. You made me believe I deserved happiness." "You always deserved it," Ethan sighed. "I am just grateful you chose to share your life with me." They stood there as the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars they had watched on so many nights over the years. Ethan pulled Violet close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. His hands moved where she could see them in the last light of day. "I love you." "I love you too," she signed back. The 3 signs that had become their touchstone. The words that Ethan had worked so hard to learn to express in a way Violet could fully receive. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Violet reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the young woman on the stagecoach, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. She thought about how Ethan had seen past her deafness to the person she was, how he had put in the effort to truly communicate with her, how he had built a family with her where sign language was just as important as spoken words. She thought about her children, all of them bilingual in a way that went beyond just English and Spanish. They could move between the hearing world and the deaf world seamlessly, and they had grown up understanding that there were many ways to communicate, all of them valid. Sam's daughter Emma, now 5, was already fluent in sign, and the new baby Jacob and Beth were expecting would grow up the same way. Inside the house, Rose was teaching Daniel a new card game, their hands moving in sign as they talked and laughed. When Violet and Ethan entered, both children looked up and signed greetings. Rose had made supper, and the four of them sat down to eat together, the conversation flowing naturally between spoken words and signed ones. After supper, Daniel went to bed, and Rose settled down with a book. Ethan worked on some accounts while Violet finished a painting she had started, a landscape of the ranch at sunrise. Every so often, they would look up and catch each other's eye, smiling that private smile of couples who have been together long enough to communicate without words. When Rose finally said goodnight and headed to her room, Violet and Ethan were left alone. Ethan set aside his work and came to look at Violet's painting. His hands moved in sign. "You have captured it perfectly. The light, the colors, the feeling of this place." "I paint what I love," Violet signed back. They prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routine. When they were settled under the quilts Violet had made years ago, Ethan pulled her close. In the darkness, she could not see to read lips or signs, but she knew his presence, the feel of him beside her, the steady beat of his heart. She felt him shift, and then he was tapping on her arm in the pattern they had developed for communicating in the dark. Morse code modified for their purposes. The message was simple. "Good night, I love you," she tapped back. "I love you too, always." The years continued their steady march. Rose eventually married a schoolteacher who had come to Tucson from back east, a man who learned sign language to communicate with his mother-in-law and who fit seamlessly into the Irving family. Daniel showed such promise with his art that Ethan and Violet sent him to study in San Francisco for 2 years, and when he returned, he was full of new techniques and ideas. Violet's hair began to show silver threads, and Ethan's dark hair went gray at the temples. They both moved a little slower, and Ethan's knees ached on cold mornings, a legacy of years of hard physical labor. But they were healthy and active, surrounded by children and grandchildren who visited often. One spring day in 1902, when Violet was 42 and Ethan was 50, they received an unexpected visitor. A young woman stepped down from the stagecoach in Tucson, looking around with wide, frightened eyes. She was met by a rancher named Thomas Edwards, a widower from the western edge of the county who had sent for a mail-order bride. Sarah Miller, who still lived on the neighboring ranch and had remained close friends with Violet, came to visit the next day with news. The young woman, whose name was Clara, was deaf. Thomas had not known, and when he discovered it, he had been at a loss. He had no idea how to communicate with her, and he was on the verge of sending her back east. "I told him about you," Sarah said, looking at Violet. "I said he should come talk to you and Ethan, that you could help him understand that being deaf does not mean Clara cannot be a good wife." Violet's heart went out to this young woman, facing the same fear and uncertainty she had experienced 20 years earlier. She signed to Ethan. "We should go talk to them. We can help." Ethan nodded immediately. "Yes, we can show him it is possible." The next day, Ethan and Violet drove into town to the hotel where Thomas and Clara were staying. Thomas was a rough-looking man in his 40s, weathered by sun and wind, with the uncertain expression of someone who had gotten more than he bargained for. Clara sat in a corner of the hotel lobby, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes downcast. She looked defeated. Violet approached her slowly, making sure Clara could see her coming. When Clara looked up, Violet began to sign. "Hello, my name is Violet. I am deaf too." Clara's eyes widened in shock, and then hope flooded her face. Her hands moved frantically. "You are deaf. You live here. How?" I came here 20 years ago, a mail-order bride like you. My husband learned to communicate with me. We have 4 children and a good life. It is possible." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks and she signed. "He wants to send me back. He says he cannot deal with a deaf wife. I have nowhere else to go." Violet sat down beside her and took her hands. "Let me talk to him. Let us show him it can work." While Violet stayed with Clara, Ethan took Thomas aside. He spoke plainly, telling the man about his own experience with Violet, about how learning to communicate had been an effort but a worthwhile one. He explained about sign language, about lip reading, about the many ways deaf people navigated the world. "I am not saying it will be easy," Ethan said. "It was not easy for us at first, but Violet is the best thing that ever happened to me. She is smart and hard-working and kind. Being deaf is just one aspect of who she is. If Clara is anything like her, you would be a fool to send her away without giving her a chance." Thomas looked over at Clara, who was deep in signed conversation with Violet, her hands moving expressively and her face animated in a way it had not been when he had first met her. "I do not know sign language," he said. "I do not know if I can learn." "Do you want a wife?" Ethan asked. "Do you want a partner to share your life with? Because if you do, Clara could be that person, but you have to be willing to put in the effort." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. "All right, I will try, but I will need help." Over the next several weeks, Violet and Ethan became mentors to Thomas and Clara. They invited them to the ranch, showed them how they had built their life together. They gave Thomas the old sign language manual they still had, worn with use, and Ethan spent hours teaching him basic signs. Violet worked with Clara, helping her gain confidence and teaching her about life in Arizona. Gradually, Thomas and Clara began to communicate. It was halting at first, frustrating for both of them, but they kept trying. Violet could see Clara blossoming, her earlier defeat giving way to cautious optimism. Thomas, for his part, seemed surprised by how much he was coming to care for this quiet young woman. They married in June, with Ethan and Violet standing up as witnesses. At the reception held at the Irving ranch, Violet watched Thomas and Clara together. He was signing to her, the movement still clumsy but sincere, and she was smiling, really smiling for what looked like the first time in weeks. Clara came over to Violet and signed. "Thank you. You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me this was possible." "You would have found your way," Violet signed back, "but I am glad we could help." Later, Ethan signed to Violet. "Do you remember feeling like she did, afraid and uncertain, every day?" Violet signed. "Until you showed me, I did not have to be afraid anymore. We built something good," Ethan signed. "And now we can help others build good things too." As the summer evening wore on and the celebration continued, Violet looked around at the gathering. Her children were there with their spouses and her grandchildren, now numbering 6 with another on the way. Sam was telling a story to a group of men, his hands moving in sign out of habit even though he was speaking aloud. Rose was playing with her nieces and nephews, the children's laughter silent to Violet but visible in their open mouths and bright eyes. Jacob was deep in conversation with Thomas about horses, using both sign and speech so Clara could follow along. Ethan came up behind Violet and wrapped his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him and his hands moved where she could see them. "Happy," she turned in his arms to face him and her hands signed clearly. "More than I ever thought possible. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Ethan signed back. Then his hands formed the 3 signs that never got old, that still made her heart flutter even after 20 years. "I love you." "I love you too," Violet signed, and she kissed him there in the midst of their family and friends, the community they had built together. As the years rolled on into the new century, Violet and Ethan aged gracefully together. Their children had children who had children of their own. The ranch prospered and grew, eventually becoming one of the most successful in southern Arizona. But more important than the material success was the legacy of communication and understanding they had built. Every child and grandchild in the Irving family learned sign language as naturally as they learned to speak. It became a point of pride, something that made them different and special. And when any of them encountered deaf people in their travels or business, they were able to communicate, to bridge a gap that many others could not. Violet became known throughout the region as someone who would help newly arrived mail-order brides, deaf or hearing, adjust to life in the West. She had a gift for making people feel welcome, and her home was always open. Ethan supported her fully in this, seeing it as an extension of the kindness and community they had always tried to build. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1907, their children threw them a party that brought together people from all over the county. There were speeches and toasts, and a beautiful cake that Rose had made. But the best moment came at the end of the evening when Ethan stood up and called for everyone's attention. He began to speak, but as he spoke, he also signed, so that Violet could follow along perfectly. 25 years ago, I took a chance on a woman I knew only through letters. I sent for a mail-order bride because I was lonely and wanted a partner. What I got was so much more than I could have imagined. Violet, you made me a better man. You taught me patience and perseverance. You showed me that communication is about more than just words. It is about truly seeing and hearing the other person, even when you cannot literally hear them. He paused, and Violet could see emotion shining in his eyes. You gave me a family, a home full of love and laughter. You worked beside me to build this ranch into what it is today. You are my partner in every sense of the word. And I want you to know, in front of all these people, that I am grateful every single day that you stepped off that stagecoach in Tucson. Then his hands moved through the 3 signs that had become their private language, their declaration of love. I love you. The room erupted in applause, though Violet could only feel the vibrations of it. She stood and moved to Ethan's side, her own hands signing for all to see. And I love you. Thank you for learning my language. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for giving me a life beyond my wildest dreams. They embraced, and around them, their family and friends cheered. It was a moment of perfect joy, the culmination of 25 years of partnership and love. As Violet and Ethan moved into their 60s and 70s, they gradually stepped back from the daily running of the ranch, letting their children take over fully. They spent their time tending a smaller garden, visiting with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. They had been together so long that they often communicated without needing to sign, a glance or a gesture conveying volumes. On a warm evening in the spring of 1920, 38 years after Violet had first arrived in Tucson, they sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Ethan was 70 now, his hair white and his face deeply lined. Violet was 60, her auburn hair gone silver, but her green eyes still bright and alert. They held hands, watching the sun set over the mountains, the same view they had been watching for nearly 4 decades. The ranch was peaceful, the sound of children playing drifting up from Sam's house below. Everything was golden in the evening light. Ethan turned to Violet, his movements slower now but still deliberate. His hand signed. Do you remember the first time I signed I love you to you? Of course, Violet signed back. I cried. I was so nervous, Ethan signed. I had practiced for days. I wanted to get it right. It was perfect, Violet signed. It was the moment I knew for certain that we would be all right. We have been more than all right, Ethan signed. We have been blessed. Violet squeezed his hand, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear. She thought about the long journey that had brought her here, from a lonely girl in Philadelphia to a woman with a full life, surrounded by love. She thought about the courage it had taken to board that stagecoach, to travel across the country to marry a stranger. And she thought about Ethan, the man who had seen her deafness not as an obstacle but simply as a difference, who had put in the time and effort to learn to communicate with her in the language that worked best for her. He had learned to sign "I love you," but more than that, he had learned to show his love in 1,000 daily actions, in patience and kindness and partnership. As the night deepened and the air cooled, Ethan helped Violet to her feet, and they went inside together. Their home was full of memories, every corner holding some story from their years together. Photographs lined the walls, capturing weddings and births and ordinary moments that had become extraordinary simply because they had lived them together. They prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routine. When they lay down together, Ethan pulled Violet close and she rested her head on his shoulder. In the darkness, he tapped out the message on her arm. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for coming to Arizona. Thank you for building this life with me." She tapped back. "Thank you for asking. Thank you for learning to sign. Thank you for loving me." They fell asleep that way. Two people who had started as strangers and had become one, bound together by love and language and the life they had built on a ranch in the Arizona desert. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first uncertain conversations and every moment since. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of sage and dust and home. In the morning, they would wake and begin another day, tending their garden and playing with their great-grandchildren and enjoying the simple pleasures of a life well lived. There would be more sunsets to watch and more stories to tell and more moments of connection in the language they shared. But for now, they slept peacefully, two hearts beating in sync, surrounded by the family and community they had created, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and that their love would echo through generations to come. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Tucson 38 years earlier had found far more than she had ever dared to hope for, and the cowboy who had learned to sign "I love you" had discovered that communication was not about perfect words but about the willingness to truly see and be seen by another person. Together, they had built a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the power of taking a chance on love and putting in the effort to truly understand one another.